looks like we have quite a few people joining us tonight. And just from reading all the comments and chats, we love to hear where you're coming in from, so that's great. Today we've got guest speaker Doug Tallamy, but we're just going to do a couple little blurbs first, just kind of about what Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority is all about, and then we'll let him take it away. So before we get started, we want to give everyone some context of where we are and quickly go over some of the programs we're offering this year. So to start, on the map in green is the jurisdiction of the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority. Most of the land here has been converted into agricultural fields. However, we are located in one of the most diverse regions of Canada, in the Carolinian zone. So with this webinar, we hope to inspire people to conserve and contribute to our local biodiversity in any way they can. So as you can see there, we're one of the largest conservation authorities due to our watershed size. Got lots of agricultural land, and we're in the Carolinian zone there. And everyone can hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So right now we've got some funds for buffers along the waterways, tallgrass prairie, reforestation and wetland restoration projects, as well as cover crop subsidies for farmers. We also want to highlight our native tree sale that's on right now, and details can be found on our website or by contacting us. That goes until March 1st, I believe. We're also trying to gauge interest in livestock exclusion fencing funding, so please contact us if that's something that you're also interested in. And you can join us for our next webinar on the 27th, and we'll be going into more detail about these specific programs. So we've got Imagine McGregor. This event has been organized with the department by a program called Imagine McGregor. McGregor Creek is a priority area with the subshed meeting the Lower Thames, or the Thames River in downtown Chatham. Due to the land use changes, we have lost the majority of our habitat, and this being in the Carolinian zone is very significant for biodiversity. We also chose this area to focus on specifically because of the flooding that's associated with it and its connection to the city and the country. So with this program, we hope everyone gets involved in whatever capacity possible. And these are some of the main objectives here. We're trying to work with some more community partners, get the message out so people know what we're all about, get more native plants and habitats on the landscape, and really empower the community to get involved here with us. So as well as supporting the other programs our stewardship department offers in the McGregor Creek area, we also focus on events like this one with all the categories listed. So we've got giveaways, educational events such as the webinars that we're hosting tonight, volunteer opportunities. So keep watching our social media and our website and radio ads to find out when the next events are coming up. And just another reminder, you've got until March 1st to get your native trees orders in for the spring. So we really hope that you enjoy the presentation. So there'll be a Q&A in the last half an hour of the presentation. So please put any of the questions that you might have for Doug in the chat. They'll try to answer them as best as they can. So yeah, Doug, before you take it away, if you just want to say a little bit about yourself and maybe some of the things you'll be talking about tonight, and we'll send it over to you.
All right, well, thanks. First, I'm going to screen share. I'm not going to say that much about me because this is not about me. This is about saving the life on planet Earth. It's about all of us. I'm an entomologist at the University of Delaware, entering my 41st year. And I've been thinking about the role of native plants in local food webs for about the last 20 years. So got a lot of experimental data to demonstrate that they're required. We can't be switching out natives for non-natives and expect things to work the way they're supposed to. So that's an introduction to me. I want to talk to you tonight about what I consider to be nature's best hope. But before I do that, I want to talk about E.O. Wilson's book that he wrote in 2016. Many of you probably heard that Dr. Wilson died the day after Christmas this year. He was 92. And just a giant in the field of conservation and biodiversity and many other fields. He started independent fields all himself. But in 2016, he wrote the book called Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, which was one of the major themes of his career. He wanted to save biodiversity. And what he said in this book was very straightforward. We have to save nature. We have to have functioning ecosystems on half of the planet if we're going to save it on any of the planet. And of course, we have to save it on the planet or we're going to lose life ourselves. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't talk a whole lot about how we're going to save nature on half of planet Earth. So it's an interesting message, and conservation biologists are all excited about it. Like, let's save half the Earth. The problem is we already have half of the planet in terrestrial Earth in some form of agriculture, and almost 8 billion of us are in the other half with all of our infrastructure and our detritus and airports and everything else. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So the question is, how can we possibly do what E.O. Wilson wants us to do? And I think we can do it. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I think we can realize E.O.'s dream, but in order to do that, we need a new approach to conservation. Before talk about that approach, let's talk about what happened in 2019 along the east coast of the U.S. We had what we call an oak mast. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I am easily entertained. So I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole for its head, forced its head through there, and it forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze, made it look like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down, and that's a dangerous time for that insect larva because there's a lot of things that want to eat it. It's very good to eat. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds, it goes underground, and then it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then it stays there for 2 whole years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what a weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay their eggs in that hole, and that's how the larva gets down there. Now you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. After they leave the acorn, though, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum in the acorn, and you know that nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils and acorns. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get very excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new hole in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they will live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? Point is very simple. That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn from the tree and they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree, tap it beneath the surface of the soil. And then the object is they're going to go back and get it in the wintertime and have something to eat. Well, for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one of those acorns is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they're actually planting 3 oak trees. And oaks depend on that acorn dispersal. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have lots of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. North America's got about 4,000 species of native bees. And over a third of them are highly specialized on particular pollens. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all night, all week, all year about specialized relationships. But today, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, save it or leave it as it is. With those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Unfortunately, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of north of Mexico, North America, north of Mexico, that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the number of species and the abundance of those species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. So you might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this, and I don't know. But I suspect we thought that our Earth, our nest, was so big that we could foul it forever, and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing pretty scary headlines these days. Things like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's almost a third of the North American bird population, already gone. The UN says, oh, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. I don't know if you heard, but we removed 23 species from the endangered species list about a month ago. Not because we've saved them, but because they're already extinct. So this is already happening, but you know what? We can't allow it to happen. It's not an option. We cannot lose the species that are running the ecosystems that we all depend on. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, this upon all of our houses, but that is not what this talk is about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. Insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, even many of our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi to recycle nutrients. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it, and we're going to have to change the way we landscape pretty soon. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on what we call ecosystem services, the life support that nature provides for us. Here are just some of the things that plants do that we depend on. Like they produce oxygen, pretty important. They clean water after it falls and slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. They capture carbon, pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, build their tissues out of that carbon, and then pump the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited over the eons. Extremely important these days. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. That's going to be hard. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before because we've got more people on the planet than ever before consuming a lot of ecosystem services. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves, but they're not working. We wouldn't be in the sixth grade extinction if they were working. So we have to start to do conservation on private land. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent, wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that are good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, move to another place, do the same thing, completely wrecking those places. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough so that we did not destroy local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic, wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't write about, though, is developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. But what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservation worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where we've torn it apart, where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Back to private property. Again, we've got to do conservation on private property because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. I don't know what the statistics are for Canada, but I think particularly in Southern Canada, it's very similar. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail because our parks and preserves are too small, too few, and too isolated to conserve the amount of nature that we need to run the ecosystems we all depend on. Well, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve all the areas that are not yet wrecked. We certainly want to do that, but we need to reconstruct the areas that are wrecked. We need to restore ecosystems. Now, I know people are going to say you're never going to put it back exactly the way it was, and that's true. We won't, but we can reunite enough of those specialized relationships so that you have functioning ecosystems once again. In order to do that, though, you have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most powerful species and then add others later on. And the two groups we can't do without, one would be the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They, of course, are capturing energy from the sun, turning it into food through photosynthesis, locking it up in their tissues. So now we have food locked up in the tissues of plants, particularly their leaves. We have to get that food to animals or we won't have any animals. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. That's something typically is invertebrates, and it's usually insects. And out of the insects, caterpillars turn out to be the most important group that are transferring energy from plants to other animals. Caterpillars are transferring more energy to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars, we've got failed food webs. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Now you've got the black-capped chickadee up there doing just about the same thing, almost the same bird. They're the birds that are feeders right now, eating seeds, and we tend to think that's all chickadees need. Well, 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. But when they're going to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds. So they give seeds up and they switch entirely to insects. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars, and they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a few years ago. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds when they were feeding their young during the springtime, when they were bringing food to the nest. They're going to send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And she got thousands of pictures, so she did a great job. Here's a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of nestling diets that were caterpillars in the 20 most common bird families that she had data for. And in 16 out of the 20 most common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system? Very few birds would be able to successfully reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? Actually, several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's its cuticle. It's made of chitin, which is undigestible. The birds don't want a lot of undigestible material. And because they're soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're very nutritious, very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. Much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. So where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? They're getting them from what they eat, of course, but vertebrate or carotenoid content is not equally distributed among vertebrate prey items. These first two bars are types of caterpillars. Far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves then. Carotenoids come from green leaves. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are probably not optional parts of bird diets. It looks like they are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough, or one or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees. We've got a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to reach the point where they fledge, where they leave the nest. That depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do because in so many places that's all we have, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not make all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that we're measuring. We went to the data set that Rosenberg et al. Used in their paper that said we've lost 3 billion birds. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups. The species that do not require insects during their life history, so things like doves and finches can actually reproduce on seed, and the species that do require insects, particularly during breeding. Well, the species that don't require insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years, but the species that do require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that there is a relationship between the amount of bird food out there and how well the birds are doing. Not a huge surprise. So we need to rethink about the goals of our landscaping. In the past, we've landscaped with one goal in mind, and that is to make pretty landscapes. So we've used plants as decorations. But we can still make pretty landscapes, but we're going to have to consider the ecological function of those plants as well. And one of their functions has to be to create the insects that run our food webs. So how do we bring caterpillars to our yards? You do that by adding the plants that support caterpillars. Seems straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about it. We have to add the plants that do support a lot of caterpillars, and we have to be fussy about it because most of the caterpillars themselves are fussy about what they eat. And the monarch butterfly is a perfect example. You can have all the calorie pear and all the boxwood and all the burning bush and all the buckthorn and all the Asian ornamentals that we landscape with so often in your yard, the hostas and all of those things. And you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Well, because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've protected their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a very effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect can't adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two plant lineages that are very similar in how they protect themselves. And they develop specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds. Specialized behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, exactly the way I've just described. And that's why after they've specialized, they are locked in to what they're specialized on. So if we take away the milkweeds and replace them with hostas, the monarchs don't start eating hostas. They can't. They're locked into milkweeds. And that's why when we bring in plants from Asia and use them as decorations in our yard, they destroy the food web because our insects can't eat them. And if those same plants like buckthorn, like burning bush, escape into our natural areas, they destroy the food webs in the natural areas as well. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to reconstruct viable food webs to support our local ecosystems, we have to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants. I'm going to start with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. That's what the house looked like. It was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. And the last thing they did on that farm was a very old farm. Been farmed about 300 years. Last thing they did was to mow it for hay. So very, very few plants were there, certainly very few woody plants. So our goal was to reconstruct the food web that belongs in the eastern deciduous forest in southeast Pennsylvania. And in order to do that, we got to bring the caterpillars back. So here's an example. I wanted to see if I could attract the Canadian owlet to our little piece of land here. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, you don't have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow-rue. That's the only plant they eat, host plant specialization, just like the monarch. And we didn't have any meadow-rue. There's no meadow-rue anywhere around us. The whole place was farmed to death for hundreds of years. So I got some meadow-rue seed from someplace and planted it, and it grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow-rue. Maybe they had to come all the way from Canada. I didn't know. So I didn't even go out and check it for about 2 months after I planted it. And then I was walking by for another reason, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the Goldenrod Stowaway. That beautiful orange moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. Actually, that's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seed, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. Well, it took a year for the Goldenrod Stowaway to find my ditch daisy. They finally did. And now we've got a good population of both of those. Now we've added 4 species to the property. Hackberry Emperor, one of the Hackberry Emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that ought to be here. But as its name suggests, it needs hackberry. We didn't have any hackberry, so I planted it, Celtis. Took 4 years for the butterflies to find our hackberry, but they finally did. I looked at one of my hackberry branches in June. There were 9 Hackberry Emperor caterpillars on a single branch. So now we've added 6 species, and that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many things that specialize on goldenrod, like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidura flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come. It should be here, but it's not. That's what the caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I look for these caterpillars in the fall. One of these years I'm going to find them, and that'll be a great day. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. Makes very nutritious berries for the birds in the fall, very high in fat. Excuse me. It's a very good pollinator plant in the spring. The flowers are small and inconspicuous, and you probably don't even know it's in flower until you see this cloud of bees that's around it. Remember, when you're planting a pollinator garden, you're planting it for the pollinators, not necessarily for the showiness that you enjoy. I planted a Virginia creeper because it's the primary host plant of the large sphinx moths that are a major component of the diet of cardinals. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. And of course, we lost our elms to Dutch elm disease a long time ago. But there are at least two big mature elms at the University of Delaware that are doing well, and they're making lots of seed. I got some of those seeds shortly after we moved in, planted them at my house, and they grew very nicely. Those trees are now 80 feet tall, and they attracted the double-toothed prominent right away. American elm. One of the evening primrose moth, because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted that. Moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, this is just examples of the plant lineages we put back in our yard, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. Some of you might know it. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if your oak has to be 400 years old before you enjoy it, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local landscape, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the caterpillar-based food web. Of course, they're moths as adults, by bringing in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars. Moths have come to the oaks on our property. And they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that plant. So you don't have to wait centuries for your oak to start to rebuild that food web, rebuild the ecosystem where you live. This is what our house looks like today, or actually in the summertime. So got a little lawn here. We're very traditional, but we put a lot of plants back. And I noticed right away, of course, as soon as you add the plants that used to be there, the food web revives itself. And there's no better way to get an index of how well you're doing in your restoration than to count the number of caterpillar species that are making a living where you live. And that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years, taking a picture of every species of moth that I could find. I am up to 1,140 species. Haven't gotten to the butterflies yet, just 1,140 species of moths now making a living on our property. Now we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And we have them because we put the plants back. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we saw last year. World Wildlife Fund says that we have lost 2/3 of wildlife from planet Earth since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back that belong there. Just some of them. We're not finished putting the plants back. So this reviving the life around you is much easier than we make it out to be. Don't throw your hands up in despair. There is lots of hopes if we all get together and start planting. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres. A lot of people don't have that much land. Will it work on smaller properties in suburbia? And that's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in a typical development surrounded by everybody with the big lawns. Now, when they moved in, their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle from Asia. So they pulled that out, put in 75 species of native plants, added a water feature to their backyard they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that have used their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it happen on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, right on the other side of this wall here is a tower for O'Hare Airport. She got 1/10 of an acre, tiny little plot, not attached to any natural area in the Chicago area. Over here is Kennedy Expressway. So it's a pretty 1/10 of an acre, but it is isolated. And 1/10 of an acre, by the way, is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, added a water feature for the birds, and then she sat back and started to count the birds. And she tells me she does that with a glass of wine in the afternoon. She's up to 120 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock in a while, go to Pam's house. All right, there are 4 things that we have to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to shrink the area that we have in lawn in North America. Just in the US, we've got over 40 million acres of lawn. That's the size of New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, I know we need lawn to advertise our high status, and we need lawn to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that is now in lawn? Cut that 40 million acres in half. What if we took this and made it look like this? This is a young planting, but I got this pictures the other day from Dan Getman in Missouri, I think he is. He's doing it. He's reducing a huge lawn by putting in a lot of native plants. If we did that on 20 million acres, we could build a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badland National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park be the biggest national park in the United States. What do you get when you put a park right at home? When you put some part of nature right at home, you get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature, and you can do it at your own pace, your own time. All you have to do is go outside. You can avoid crowds. Last year there were 375 million people that went to our national parks. So you go to a national park, you spend a lot of time sitting in a parking lot. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the road. There are no travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world at home, alone, the peace and quiet of your yard. And I think that's essential, this alone part, not mediated by somebody else. You can develop the relationship that you want with the natural world. And I think this is critically important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher and they drive for an hour and they walk around a natural area for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But if they have some part of the natural world at home, all they have to do is go outside alone and learn how to interact with it. Alone, no parental supervision. Let them work it out by themselves. They will come home again, I guarantee it. This is so important because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't know that they should be stewarding the planet, if they don't know how to steward, if they don't want to steward the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we don't need any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter who lives in Hawaii on a very, very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of lawn with a hedge, but there are anoa lizards there, which fascinated her. When she learned that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground, you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards cannot see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay, but you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you'll learn how to take care of a lizard. You develop a personal relationship with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress the rest of her life catching lizards. I don't think. She sent me this picture, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Strinicity's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, soon in Canada, you're going to be able to do that. We're working with the David Suzuki Foundation to extend our Homegrown National Park map up into Canada. And when that happens, you put in your area and the amount of area that you are protecting, either converting to native plants, or you already have, or you've got a woodlot you're protecting. And that will register you as a member of Homegrown National Park. It's free. And we'll get to see this message that everybody is an important component of the future of conservation. We'll get to see that message spread virally. The map will light up, and we hope it works. We're trying to reach the people who don't already know this. And unfortunately, that's most people. It's not that they don't care, they just don't know they're supposed to care. So we get on the map, we get our friends to get on the map, and it should work. We're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the areas that once were lawn? I'm going to argue that some of those have to be keystone plants. What's a keystone plant? Well, remember what a keystone is. This is the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of our native food webs, the food web collapses because they're the ones making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. So think of the keystone plants in your yard as the 2x4s that are holding up the ecological house that you're building. They're essential. The house is not going to stand up without those supports. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do with our decorations for the last 100 years. You're not through building your house once you have your keystone plants, but they're a necessary start. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants better than non-natives ecologically? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of native plants that are not supporting that much in terms of food web. So the question really is, do we want to put the native species in our yards that are supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars or not? Every once in a while, I get a message from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not as simple as whether they're native or not, it's whether they're doing anything or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago or today. They support 0 species of caterpillars here today. And that's the important metric. They're there, they're taking up space, but they are not supporting the local food web. What is supporting the food web better than any other plant genus in the entire North America? It's one of the oaks, members of Quercus. In the mid-Atlantic states where I live, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that in terms of supporting local food webs. And if you want to know what the keystone plants are where you live, you go to the National Wildlife Federation website, now if you live in the US, you put in your zip code and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants for your county pop up. So if you people are an hour from Detroit, put in the zip code of whatever county Detroit's in, and you'll get a map that's relevant to where you're living. So notice I say native oaks, native cherries. This is just a representative list. And, I stopped because I ran out of room. The list is much bigger than that of the most powerful plants. But I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to the nursery and say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I want to buy a willow, they're going to sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, it'll probably be a European birch. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these very powerful genera. Otherwise, it's going to reduce caterpillar use by 68%. We've done that experiment. These are the most powerful herbaceous genera. Goldenrod's always way up there. The various genera, asters are broken up into helianthus, sunflowers, very powerful genus. Those 3 alone not only produce a lot of caterpillars, but they also are the best plants for supporting specialist bees. Remember, there's a lot of bees, about 1/3 of our bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. If we don't plant for specialists, we're going to lose those specialists. The generalists can use those plants as well. So plant for the specialists, and those 3 genera are the best for specialists. You can get over 44 species of bees with those genera alone. And if you don't have them in your yard, that's 44 species of bees that you will not have. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to attract a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. We're learning from a great deal of research that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly those really important moths at night. This is good news to me, believe it or not, because we have to turn around insect decline. Insects, the little things that run the world, the little things keeping us alive on planet Earth, we've already lost 45% of them. If we can turn this around by simply flicking a switch, turning out our lights, we're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. Well, I can't turn the light out over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to notice is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb that is out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. If we switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we will save millions of insects and millions of dollars too, because LEDs, of course, are much more energy efficient. We're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in Keystone Plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come and kill all of our insects. I don't know if Mosquito Joe is as big in Canada as it is in the US, but it's a huge industry in the US these days, undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 15 years. Mosquito Joe says this is okay because it's a natural product. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids. It's that's the compound that's in chrysanthemums. But cyanide is a natural product too. So that doesn't mean much to me. He also says it only kills insects or only kills mosquitoes. And I wish he was right. But in fact, it kills all the insects that it comes in contact with. Not this fall, but 2 falls ago, there were big headlines about monarch kills that flew through Mosquito Joe's work, hundreds of monarchs dead on the ground. It kills them all. The big thing is it doesn't work. We're trying to control mosquitoes, and you don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the adult mosquitoes. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. So he's not even close to working, which is why he has to keep coming back and back and keep charging you over and over again for something that's killing non-targets. If you really want to kill mosquitoes, get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, let it ferment for a couple of days. This is during the warm season, of course. You're building up the population of diatoms and algae, and that becomes irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes. They're going to lay their eggs in there. Once they do that, you go to the hardware store and you get Mosquito Dunks. You put in one of these discs that's Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic Diptera. And the only aquatic Diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larvae. Now, aquatic Diptera are really important in aquatic systems. So don't go throwing these around your lakes and marshes and things. Keep it in your bucket. Then it'll be very targeted and will only kill mosquitoes. If a dragonfly gets in there, it's not going to hurt it. If a bird drinks it or your dog licks it, no problem at all. You might put a coarse screen over it so the mosquitoes can get through, but a chipmunk or something won't fall in and drown. But if everybody did this, it would be targeted, cheap, and we would control a lot of mosquitoes. Fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those all-important caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves of the tree. Then it spins a cocoon and hangs from a branch. Then it emerges as an adult. Then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. I wish all of the species did that, but most of them don't. 94% of them, 480 of those species, drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And the ground is mowed and compacted so that it's rock hard and the caterpillars can't get underground. The way we typically landscape becomes an ecological trap. We pull in adult moths to lay their eggs, the caterpillars grow, and then they drop down and die. And I am convinced this is another major cause of insect declines. But it's one that's easily reversed. All we have to do is think about what happens under these trees. Of course, the cement landscape is not going to be the answer. This is what most people do. You put a tree in a yard. Now, we're just starting to measure how caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you've got a tree and you have a layered landscape. You've got maybe a dogwood here and then a native azalea, ferns and ground cover. It's a safe site. The caterpillars can drop down. They can easily get underground to pupate, or they can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's down here. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. We're not trying to reduce the amount of gardening here. We're increasing it. This is the way you shrink your lawn. You put big beds around all of your trees. Then you've got less lawn and you've got safe sites. Use your ground covers liberally, like things like wild ginger or May apples or foam flower or ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maple trees. So any caterpillar developing on these trees will drop into this fern bed and complete their development, even though it's the middle of a city. So we can do a lot better with our moths just by thinking about how we landscape under our trees. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, has done some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her work has shown that there is room for compromise in our plant choices, and that's good news to me. What you do is ask the simple question, how well do chickadee populations do in suburban landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus ones dominated by typical introduced ornamental plants? And when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So the amount of bird food is reduced by 75% right away. They're 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. All of these landscapes have nest boxes up in them, but the chickadee comes and looks around and says, not enough food here, we're not even going to try. If they do try, they produce 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches are 29% less likely to survive at all. If they do survive, they produce 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it takes them 1.5 days longer to do that. If you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass, this is what you get. We focus on woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you've got a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer babies than adults die, anything over here under the line, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. And look where that happens when you've got more than 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native. So this is the area of a compromise that suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. And none of these could be invasive plants. No barberry, no buckthorn, no burning bush. Because those are ecological tumors. I mean, they're just spreading and castrating our natural areas. But you can have your ginkgo, you can have your forsythia, you can have your boxwood, things that we know are not going to spread without destroying the local food web as long as it's not dominating the landscape. Here's our Dan Getman landscape again. That's a ginkgo. He's got a ginkgo there because his wife loves ginkgos and she wanted one. Is it destroying the function of this landscape? Absolutely not. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. If we get a lot more native plants into our landscapes, we can tolerate some of the non-invasive non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken from a drone at 400 feet. It's a big garden. Every plant in that garden is a native plant, and you don't get more formal than that. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal gardens all the time in Europe. And I guess that's okay over there because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a regular suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. This formalizes it. That tells people it's not just a patch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's meeting the needs of a number of bee species. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Remember why we want pollinators. The media will tell you want them because they pollinate a third of your food. It's really about a 1/12 of your food. But then people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the agriculture argument. We need pollinators because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Again, if we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Every place we need plants, which is every place. What about this? A Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Absolutely. And many of them are doing it. Minnesota was one of the leaders, has a it's called the Lawn to Legume program. It's a cost sharing program where the state is helping homeowners reduce the area of lawn by putting in appropriate Minnesota prairie plants, help pay for it. very popular. Pennsylvania's got a new lawn conversion program. You get up to $5,000 per acre by converting your lawn. So it's a new program, so it's just getting started. It was designed to help watershed management, but this is a great example of where you can kill two birds with one stone. If you use native plants when you reduce the amount of lawn, you're not only helping the watershed, but you're also helping biodiversity. Florida, there's an island off of Florida that's paying residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Burrowing owls are listed species. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, Fayetteville, Arkansas, South Carolina, North Carolina, they all have bounties on calorie pears. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. As a matter of fact, I think South Carolina just banned calorie pears altogether. And even water utilities are getting into the act. In San Antonio, you get a $100 coupon to plant water efficient native plants rather than the very thirsty non-native plants. And of course, the big lawn conversion programs in California. This is now up to $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you take out and put in appropriate xeric planting. California, even though they're getting rain right now, they don't have a single drop to waste on cool season European grasses, and they're finally recognizing that. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is we've come to think that nature is optional. This is a serious misstep. We like nature, but very few of us think it's essential, which means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our country's, our country's, most of the world's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. This was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for the national park system. They're wonderful places, beautiful, scenic places. We need to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. And I understand that, but it suggests that nature's there just for entertainment. It is far more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to the areas where there's relatively few humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small, too few, and too isolated from each other. David Quammen has a really powerful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our roadsides, including our corporate landscapes, including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to glue our rug back together again by adding the plants that we've removed from our lives, not just to build biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to build viable habitats where we've destroyed them, where we live, work, farm, play. When we do this, it'll be the first time in modern history that we humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. You would think there'd be nothing more important than being a good steward of those ecosystems. Everybody shares that responsibility. Stan Rushworth, Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers about their obligations to Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, the earth has terrible problems right now. Most people feel overwhelmed. What can a single person do? Well, a single person can shrink the lawn. A single person can put in a pollinator garden, can remove their invasive species. We didn't even talk about that. Can turn out their lights, can use keystone species. A single person can totally revitalize the little ecosystem where they live, contribute to their local ecosystem instead of degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just think about the little piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I will be happy to take questions now if you have any. If anybody's around to ask me those questions.
Sorry.
There we are.
Go ahead.
All right, sorry, it wasn't working here to be able to see anything. So there's been lots of questions coming in. So I'll start with the first one that I saw here. And just bear with me, everyone. I'll make sure that we get to everyone's questions. I'll just kind of go in order here, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Leanne's question is, hi, how could I find out what caterpillars are native to my area in Sudbury, Ontario?
Well, this is where that native plant finder comes in. It works both ways. Not only will it tell you the number of caterpillars that the different plants where you live host, but you can work backwards. It'll tell you what those caterpillars are as well. So Ontario, you know, you would go drop directly south of it and pick a county. I don't know what's south of it, New York, someplace. And that will give you a very good reading of what's happening in and around Ontario. We don't have this data for all of Canada. It'd be great if we did, but if you want it for Canada, you can fund my research technician. She's the one that digs up all the data. Took us 3 years to put this together. So, but that's a good estimate. Look at something very just south of where you are in the U.S.
All right. Then Matthew says, could you explain the procedure of growing an oak from an acorn?
Yes, I can. So oaks have different taxonomic groups. There's the white oak group. That's the Quercus group and the red oak group. What is that? The Verentes group. Anyway, the white oak group and the red oak group. White oaks germinate in the fall. So they fall from the tree and they germinate within a few days. So what that means is their root goes down and then they'll just sit there the rest of the winter and put up green leaves in the spring. So if you're trying to plant a white oak, so that's a white oak or a post oak or a swamp white oak, anything in the white oak group, chestnut oak is in the white oak group. You want to plant those in the fall. Red oak groups germinate in the spring, so you can collect them. And the safest thing to do is to get some peat moss, put those acorns with the peat moss in a Ziploc bag and put them in your refrigerator. That protects them from the rodents all winter long, keeps them moist. And then you plant them in the spring and they'll germinate in the spring. So what you want to do is tap them just beneath the soil surface the way a blue jay would, maybe ½ inch underground. And that's all they need. They'll germinate just fine. The big problem, of course, is to keep something from eating them. Even though it's put up a little bit of green, squirrels will still dig them up and eat what's left of the acorn. So you probably want to put a little cage around it. And as it gets bigger, if you've got a white-tailed deer problem, you have to put a cage around it for that too. But it doesn't take that long before they grow past the point where these animals can hurt them. And you get real trees.
All right, so then we've got a question from Camille. In a small plot, how do you recommend balancing proportion of keystone species versus plants for specialists?
Well, keystone species, there's keystone species for caterpillars, but there's also keystone plants for pollinators. And the keystone ones for pollinators are the ones that help specialist pollinators. I would look at the distribution of sun on my property. These plants that are blooming for the pollinators need full sun. And this is also where you look at your entire neighborhood. You can't get all the plants to do everything on a small property. So look at your entire neighborhood. If there's a big oak two houses down from you, that's still within the range of any of the animals using your properties. And you might say, well, okay, there's a big oak there. I'm going to focus on making a keystone laden pollinator garden because I've got the space. If there is no oak near you or no black cherry or birch or any of the other keystone woody plants, then think about putting in one or two of those. But on a very small property, you can't do everything. So.
All right, and then we've got a question here from Libby. Important question from Hopeful Urban Homegrown National Parker. Rats are a huge problem in our metropolitan Boston area. Water features, bird feeders, vegetable gardens, compost piles are all a big draw for them. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, they are a big problem. Not our house, our current house, but the house before that, we had a rat problem. A lot of people think, well, if I plant native plants and everything, I'm going to increase the rat population. No, they're eating our garbage and all the human produced waste products. That's what's keeping them going. So don't worry about that. How do you get rid of your rats? Please don't use rat poison because a rat will eat it and then it gets, as it's dying, it walks out and becomes easy prey for an owl or a hawk. And then the hawk eats it and then the hawk dies from that rat poison as well. Snap traps are the way to go. They work. You have to put them in a situation where nothing else can get to them other than rats. Just so think like a rat. It's not that hard. But then that really does work. But in a metropolitan area, they're a huge problem. We've got an awful lot of people making a lot of rat food. So.
And all right, so now we've got a question from Lynn. She says, I want to plant a native plant garden in an area where Japanese knotweed grew for 10 years. It's all been dug up and tarped since June. And I read that knotweed is an allelopathic plant that alters the soil chemistry, so nothing else can grow there. Do I need to remediate the soil first before planting all my natives? And will they be able to grow there?
I would try it out first to see how much the soil has been destroyed. We hear an awful lot. I mean, I hear, oh, nothing's going to grow under a walnut. And I hear all these stories. Most of them are kind of urban legends. Yeah, it might change the acidity a little bit, but there's a lot of things that will grow in those areas. What I'm worried about is you're going to get knotweed back because a piece of root the size of a fingernail will regenerate a plant. So it's been covered with a tarp since the spring, but you may have to cover it more than 1 year. You really want to make sure the knotweed is dead. And in the meantime, it's raining and you're getting leaching. So any of the allelopathic materials that were there are going to decrease over time. You can try it. Get a plant, get an acorn, put it out there and see if it lives. My guess is it's going to.
All right. So our next question is from Paula. It says, can Canada and the US do something to preserve the Great Lakes for all of us?
I hope so. I hope so. And it definitely needs cooperation. Most of the water that enters the Great Lakes comes from Canada. What I worry about is our Southwest that has these great plans. They keep growing and they want to drain the Great Lakes to water Los Angeles. I mean, yeah, we got to kill thinking like that. That's not going to help them.
There is a Lake Ontario, at least for Lake Erie, there's an action plan to kind of better that one. I've been doing some reading up on that. You can always just Google that. And the US has a lot to do with that too, just because, we all share the Great Lakes. So there are some groups out there, and in the next few years, they're really trying to make some differences there.
But of course, a major source of pollution in the Great Lakes is nutrients that run off from farms. So this is where riparian plantings, prairie strips that not only provide food for pollinators, but they also filter out the extra nutrients. When we ask farmers to give up land for ecological purposes, I think we should pay them for it. I think we should have a pay per use fee, just like Netflix. You pay to watch a movie, well, you pay to use the earth too. We won't call it a tax, but this is everybody in a city, everybody in Ontario, everybody in Buffalo, $1 a year. That's millions of dollars that can go towards compensating growers for giving up part of their land that then helps everybody else. I don't know. Seems like a good idea to me.
Lower Thames here, like if you're in our area here in Chatham, we have lots of programs for reducing phosphorus runoff, and you can get some money if you want to plant those buffers and things like that. So I just encourage everybody, if you're in this area, to maybe look into some of our programs and maybe see if you're not in this area, maybe just kind of go into your municipality or any of the conservations local to you and just take a look and see if that's available to you as well. I'm not sure what else is out there. I just know Lower Thames has quite a few great programs out there that you can get some incentives for. So,
everybody is in a watershed. Wherever you live, the water from your property is going somewhere. So make sure it leaves your property in good shape.
That's a great way to put that. I've got a question here from Alice. She said, explain WWF website to find plants.
Explain the
it's WWF website to find plants.
It's a National Wildlife Federation, so it's NWF.
Oh, okay.
It's called the Native Plant Finder. So you go to their website, put in Native Plant Finder, and it will come up. And it's really as simple as putting in your zip code in the US, and then the rank list for your county pops up. So it's not designed for Canada at this point. So you have to pretend you live in a county near you in the US, put in a zip code from that county, and the plants within a county, particularly in the East, are all very similar to each other. So that's how you would use it.
Perfect. And we've got Renee saying, what about climate change? How does that affect caterpillars and plants?
Well, climate change is a huge problem. We've got two giant problems on the planet. Climate change is one, and the biodiversity crisis is the other. So we really want to address climate change because it's clobbering the insects both in the West and the East in different ways. In the West, it's clobbering them through drought, and in the East, it's clobbering them through these horrendous rainstorms that we're having. When you get these giant floods, so for example, a couple of years ago, we had a thunderstorm in my yard that dropped 7 inches of rain in 3 hours and 3 inches of rain in 45 minutes. It was like a fire hose. I'm always looking at the caterpillars on my plants. And after that thunderstorm, they were gone. They were simply washed off the plants. And it took them a couple of years to start to recover. And we're getting that, time and time again in different places. So climate change is hard on the insects. Insects adapt pretty well, but these are very rigorous environmental conditions that are tough to adapt to.
We've got a question from Lawrence. They say, is trumpet vine a good plant to have growing around trees?
Yes, but it's better to put it on a snag. So a dead tree that you leave standing, planted at the base, and then it's going to grow up. It'll have plenty of sun because the leaves are not on that tree anymore. And it's like this giant pole that then makes beautiful blooms that the hummingbirds love. I do have a trumpet vine growing on an oak tree, and it's doing really well. And it's not great for that oak tree. So it's better if you put it on a snag, I think.
Okay. And we've got a question here from Amanda. She says, I'm wondering if you can speak to the effectiveness of cultivars of native plants and what to look for to know which native plant cultivars are still effective or still an effective host, if any.
Okay, that's a good question. We looked at cultivars, the cultivar question from a host plant perspective. So we were not looking at flowers. We were looking at really whether insects could use the leaves or not. And we looked at 6 different cultivar traits. One of them was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. The other traits were, changing the plant habit. So taking a tall plant, making it short, or making berries bigger, introducing disease resistance, those types of very common cultivar traits. And the only trait that consistently reduced insect use as a host plant was to make a green leaf red or purple, because that loads the leaves with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So that's a generality that I can stick to. Avoid those red leaf cultivars and you'll be in pretty good shape. Now, most of our cultivars are focused on changing flower traits. And there the news isn't so good. Annie White looked at that up in Vermont for her PhD. But there's a lot of different cultivars out there. And the answer is always going to be, it depends on what the cultivar is. So there's a cultivar of Phlox paniculata called Jenna, which was found in Georgia. It's a natural variant. It's got twice the number of flowers on it. So yes, more butterflies go to that than the ones with fewer flowers. But that's an exception. Most of the time when you change a flower trait, change the colors, make the petals bigger, make an echinacea look like a zinnia, or all these things that people do, you're messing up the relationship between the specialist bees and that plant, because flowers have very strict energy budgets. If you make the petals grow, you're probably taking energy away from pollen production and or nectar production. If you make a double flower, you're taking the reproductive parts and turning them into petals so that there is no nectar and pollen. Doesn't always wreck it, but a lot of times it does. So what I hope happens is that growers will start to sell more straight species so that you have the option. If you buy a straight species, that's going to work. If you buy a cultivar, you're taking a chance.
All right, that's perfect. And we've got Lisa. She says, after 40 years of preaching to the choir, how do you suggest we move the message out to those who don't share our perspective? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's what we hope Homegrown National Park will do. We're trying to change the culture. There are a lot of people, most people don't garden at all. Most people don't think about nature. They think we're totally separated from it. They don't think we need it. So that's been the culture. It's been more of an adversarial relationship with nature rather than a collaborative one. If we get enough people talking about it, then even the people that are on the periphery and they never think about it, they'll hear about it. They'll hear about it on the news. They'll hear about it from their neighbor at their bridge club. Changing cultures is hard, but that's why I've written the books that I've written, Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope and The Nature of Oaks. And I'm trying to get people to get this message in as many different ways as possible. What would work that we haven't done is some kind of documentary, because people watch, they don't read very much anymore.
Right. That
would reach a lot of people, but they're horrendously expensive. So if anybody's independently wealthy out there and wants to fund one, great, I'm there. But that's the goal, is to reach the people who don't have a clue. I've never had somebody say, or even heard of somebody who said, this is nonsense and we don't need to do it. It's just that they don't know about it.
Right. Then we've got Anne. She says, your book discusses the importance of conjugacy of natural land areas that help to establish habitat along an area. We are victims of the big tree chop, and development all around us, very sudden and drastic. Our property is now isolated. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can establish our natural area again?
We got to put the plants back. How much acreage do you have? You want to plant the plants. They will grow much faster than you think. The reason I talk about our property being mowed for hay is that the plants weren't here. The woody plants weren't here. Well, now I'm heating the house all winter long with trees that I planted just 20 years ago. And I've got way more wood than I can use. So and I'm doing that because I planted too many trees. I've lost my son. So So I have the opposite problem now. The plants have grown so fast and so well that I'd actually like to get a little bit of sun back and open it up a little bit. So, if all the trees were chopped down, it's a nice thing about plants is they do grow. We have to put them back. You're not going to have the 400-year-old oaks there, but it doesn't mean they can't be functional. The oak trees I planted as acorns when we moved in are 50, 60 feet tall now with trunk diameters of, almost 50 inches. So you've got your work cut out for you.
Yeah. A question from Paula. Will raptors help control rats?
Well, if they can get them, they would love them. But rats are very secretive, nocturnal creatures that are really good at avoiding raptors. I mean, raptors are really good at getting, you see them sitting on wires along the roads. They're getting voles and mice. That's what they've always hunted. But those things are silly enough to run around during the daytime so that they can get caught. Rats are hiding in our pipes and between our walls. And there was a study, actually, there are a lot of people say we should have cats out in our urban areas because they'll control the rats. And they actually did a study with it. The cats didn't catch any of the rats. So the cats were there killing the birds, but not eating the rats. So rats are pretty good at avoiding that kind of predation.
All right. And then we've got a question from Mary. We have a problem with invasive moths. Oh, and then she's Carnation Tortrix. I can't really pronounce some of these ones. Sorry. Getting rid of invasive moths probably impacts native moths. What's the answer to that?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to know what it is they're trying to get rid of them from. It sounds like a fruit tree situation. We do have some non-native moths that are causing problems. Of course, gypsy moth is one of them. And it is a conflict. You can't kill these things unless you have a specialized virus, like the gypsy moth does have a specialized virus and a specialized fungus that only kills them. But, like the emerald ash borer and winter moth and these other things that we brought in from other continents, you can poison the tree and kill the insect, but it kills all the other things that are on the tree as well. And it's a direct conflict. It's one of the serious downsides of these non-native insects. And this is why fruit trees are sprayed so heavily, because they've got, fruit moth and all of these things that eat the apples, and then we don't touch them. So it's a conflict. I don't have, biocontrol is a great answer if somebody's working on it, but most of our pests do not have biocontrol agents established at this point.
Okay, this isn't as much of a question, but Lynn, I guess, has gone on the website and she said, Canadians in Ontario, go on the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife site, look at Keystone Native Plants for Ecoregion 5, and then you'll have info on our caterpillars. So she's kind of done her research there for anyone that had that question earlier.
Good for her. Good.
Then we've got another question from Sarah. She says, if you have mature non-native trees, should you consider replacing it with a new native tree?
It depends on what it is. So a lot of them are Norway maples, and they're huge and they're expensive to take down. So definitely if there's a lightning strike or that tree dies and falls down, that's a good time to replace it. But it's not just a no-brainer of taking the tree down, because it's a big deal to do that. If you have smaller trees, easier trees like Ailanthus, that's much easier to take down. That's also a host plant for our newest invasive plant, the spotted lanternfly. So I would definitely get rid of any Ailanthus that you have. The shrubs are the ones that are seriously invasive, like the burning bush and the buckthorn and those things that make the berries and the birds spread them all around. Definitely work on them. But big trees, it sounds like it's a Norway maple, and you have to think about that.
Okay. We've got Matthew here. It says, when you added a native plant to your house, with it being the only one around, how did the birds and caterpillars find it?
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat and I wasn't paying attention. Did you ask that again?
When you added a native plant at your house, with it being the only one around, how did the birds and caterpillars find it?
Okay. Well, that's it. That's a good point. Try not to make it the only plant around. So I usually planted more than one of whatever I was planting. Now I did have the room to do that, but you do need you want a critical mass to be able to attract something. Now, if you plant one small tree and it grows into a critical mass. Insects find their host plants through volatile chemistry. The leaves put out a smell and they follow that smell to the plant. So the bigger the smell, the stronger it is, the more that's being put out, the more insects will be able to find it. That's how they find their host plants. So sometimes they can find it quickly. That's like that Canadian owlet story with the meadow row. You know, there was not a lot of plant material there, but they found it anyway, and they do it through plant volatiles. So, but if you have the option, put in more than one. Like if you're trying to help milkweeds, I have people say, well, I planted a milkweed, and you get one milkweed rammet coming up. And if a monarch lays an egg on it, the caterpillar will typically eat all the leaves on that rammet, and then they get upset. Oh, they killed my milkweed. They really haven't. It'll come up from the roots, but it's not enough material for the larvae to make it through. Plant several of them so you have a milkweed patch. I'm rambling at this point.
No, that's okay. That makes sense to me. And we've got Lynn says, are dried mealworms used in bird feeding useful to nesting birds when raising a clutch?
I don't like them because if you look at that stuff, the innards, and that's what the birds need, turn to powder and kind of fall away. And all you really have a lot of the time is exoskeleton, which is not nutritious at all. Living mealworms are a different story, but keep in mind those are beetles and they have very few carotenoids in them. So you're giving the birds something, and in a pinch, in a bad spring when you've had a lot of rain and there aren't many caterpillars, it can make the difference between a bluebird succeeding or not. But it's not a balanced diet. You want them to bring in caterpillars whenever they have the chance. But the dried mealworms, I would avoid them.
All right. Then we've got a question from Lawrence. They say, I have 2 high bush cranberries that are consumed by larvae every year. Should I just let them eat?
Well, I think, that's a viburnum. And I think you've got viburnum leaf beetle, which is an invasive insect from Europe. So it's a little beetle larva. If you can figure out that's what you have, squish them at every opportunity.
All right. And a question from Anne. She was just asking if she could share this presentation. I believe it'll be on YouTube. So you'll be able to, I don't know if you can share it from YouTube, but you can, if you want to share it with others, you can tell them about it and they can visit on YouTube. Let's go here. 1 second. All right, we've got Melanie. How much impact on the native tree species are the invasive insects having?
Well, it depends on which one you're talking about, but the emerald ash borer, for example, is having a tremendous impact. It's taking out most of the white ash and green ash from Michigan on east. So far it hasn't gone all the way south yet. We do have biocontrol programs that are looking more promising. So there was an area in northern New Jersey this past year that had 80% kill based on imported parasitoids of the eggs and the larvae. So that's very promising, but it's been a huge impact. Millions or billions of ashes have already been lost. And of course, the gypsy moth has had a huge impact on our oaks over the last 100 years. There are a number of serious pests out west that are having big impacts. Anything but a non-native plant and non-native insects have the potential of being serious pests because they're here without their natural enemies. There's nothing here to control them. So they go crazy and throw everything out of kilter. Okay,
there was kind of a 2-part question to that. They also said, are there substitute species for the ash and maple that will survive this? But you might have covered that.
No, I didn't cover that. No. I hear people say we're going to plant Asian ashes because they're resistant to the beetle. Well, yeah, but nothing will be able to eat them. So that's not replacing the ecological significance of the ashes. What we hope will happen is that a combination of controlling the pest and the ashes that have some resistance will start to spread, and you'll have new resistant genotypes that are resistant to the emerald ash borer. That's going to take decades, but it's already started to happen. We're probably not going to lose our ashes, and I'm one of the very few people saying that. Same thing with the several diseases of oaks we have. We've got sudden oak death syndrome and oak wilt and oak leaf scorch. We've got to find resistance to these things. So don't replace them with something else. Plant more and more of the same things so that the resistant genotypes will be discovered and then spread.
All right. Then we've got a question from Maria. It's a little bit vague, so I can't really go on this too much. It says, what about praying mantises?
Well, there are native praying mantises, but I don't know if there's any native praying mantises as far north as you guys are. There's several species as you move further south. So probably the one you have is the Chinese manid, which is the biggest manid. It eats hummingbirds. It sits in our flowers and eats any of the bees that come in. People will buy manid egg cases and put them in their garden so they eat pests, but they're really eating the good guys. So if it's the very large manid, it's probably the Chinese manid, and you don't want to encourage it.
Okay. And I've got a question from Hope. Say, if I have what I think is a young calorie pear tree on my property, should I definitely get rid of it? Is this one of the mentioned invasive species?
Absolutely. As they used to say, kill it before it multiplies, because it will. Once it, the calorie pears are one of the fastest spreading invasives that we have.
All right. And then Mary says, will native birds evolve to being able to being able to live and reproduce or even thrive on invasive insects?
Our native birds will eat invasive insects right now that they're able to eat. But most birds don't like hairy caterpillars. So that lets out the gypsy moth, and they're not going to evolve to like hairy caterpillars. There are two birds that already do. That's the yellow-billed cuckoo and the black-billed cuckoo. They're specialists on hairy caterpillars. But the hairs get dislodged in birds' throats and stomach walls, and most birds will avoid them. That's not going to change. That's the way it's been for millions of years. But a bird doesn't know whether it's from here or not. And if it's not distasteful, they will eat it right now.
Okay. It looks like that's all the questions. Type one in if I missed you. There was a ton of comments that were just saying great presentation. Seemed like everybody loved it. I don't have time to read everything that came in, but I'm sure you've probably been scrolling through some of those as well. We've got one more from Hope. I've replaced my front lawn completely with natives, and I'm slowly removing what I believe to be mostly non-native landscaping that was there when I moved in. How do I find out which non-native are okay to leave if they're not invasive?
Well, the easiest thing to do is take a picture and send it to me. I'll tell you what it is. There's a lot of information on the web, but taking a picture of the leaves is the easiest thing to do.
Okay, and then I've got a question here from Anne. It says, talk about invasive species. The spotted lanternfly goes after sugar maples. The tree of heaven, I've also seen them go after coniferous trees. These insects are active from April through October. What do you do to help eliminate the negative influence of the SLF?
Yeah, spotted lanternflies, they're sucking insects, so they tap into the phloem, and by doing that, they avoid a lot of the plant defenses. They do really like ailanthus, but as adults, they love vines. So they love, they get on English ivy too, but they like Parthenocissus, and they like grape a lot. They're a serious problem for the grape industry. They do really like maples for some reason. They can get on there by the tens of thousands. Well, again, they're looking at biocontrol for spotted lanternfly. But if you have a serious population on a particular plant in your yard, I suggest you get a hose if you can reach it, and get one of those attachments where you spray out fertilizer, but instead of fertilizer, put in soapy water, and soak those guys with soapy water. That knocks them off the tree. It gets rid of the wax that protects them. If you might have to do it a couple of times, but I think you can really, really get a lot of them that way.
All right. I don't see any more. Oh, lots are coming in. I don't see any more questions, I don't think. Again, just lots of positive comments coming in here soon, which is great. Just reading this last one that came in. Yep, so if you have any more questions, is there anything that can be done about Japanese beetles?
Well, Japanese beetles eat a lot of things as adults, but as larvae, they are grass specialists. We've got a lot of Japanese beetles because we have a lot of lawn with a lot of grass roots. That's where they're developing. So the best thing to do about Japanese beetles is reduce the area of lawn.
All right. And again, I don't think there's any more questions here. I'll just maybe give just one more minute. We'll probably be wrapping up here soon if I don't see much else come in.
That's good because I'm going to fall asleep.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It looks like it's kind of wrapping up here. But again, just to extend a thank you on behalf of Laura Thames for joining us tonight. This was a great presentation. I think everybody agrees. And again, this will be on our YouTube channel. So if there's something you want to go back and listen to or need more information on, you can always go back when that's posted and listen to it there. Thanks to everybody who came out for the presentation. We had a really good good turnout this time around. So I'm very happy with that.
All right. Good night, everybody.
All right. Good night. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, everybody.